Hello and welcome to the latest edition of Turbo Delphi Demos. My name is Nick Hodges. I'm the Delphi Product Manager. And today I'm going to be going into some more language features of the Delphi language, the language used by the Delphi Turbo Delphi. In the previous edition of the Turbo Demos, we looked at some very basic language constructs like the if statement, the for loop, and some other variable declarations, other things like that. And this one we're going to be going into some further language constructs, some different ways to iterate over code, and some different ways to do conditional code execution. Okay, just like we did for the last demo, the new one here, I'm going to create a console application. And again, a console application is an application that runs at the command line or inside of what is commonly referred to as a DOS box or command line. And it's just the simplest, most basic type of program you can have. It simply outputs, as a general rule, outputs text to the console window. And we talked about the basic structure of a Delphi program. Basic Delphi program has the word program and then the program name, which will in turn become the executable name. The uses clause that defines other external units or chunks of code that you can access, and then the begin and end statement, which define the main execution entry point of the application itself. And I can write code within this begin and end statements here that will execute when the program is run. In addition, we talked about how I can declare variables of various types, such as an integer, and that how in Pascal all variables must be declared before they can be used, and they must be declared ahead of time. They can't be declared in line like some other languages do. And then we talked about the if statement, where you can say if I equals 0, then execute some code, and normally that code is wrapped up into a begin-end statement. And then I could say, for instance, I could write line I is equal to 0. And now run this. Then the code inside this begin end block would only be executed if I is equal to 0. And so of course we can set I equals to 0. And so now if we run this, the right line code will be executed. I'm going to put a readline entry here just so that when the application runs, it'll pause so we can see it running. I'll save the code here, and now I run it, and you'll see, of course, since I equals 0, I is equal to 0 is written out to the console window. That's how an if statement works. Now, that is conditionally executed code. This code here only gets executed if this is true. Now, there's another construct in the Pascal Delphi language that does conditional execution, and that is the case statement. And the case statement executes code conditionally, but it allows you to have any number of different execution paths depending upon the value of a given variable. So, for instance, you could say case I of 1, and then you could write some code here that executes when I is equal to 1. And then if you wanted 2, you could write some code when I is equal to 2. Like so. So now if I set the value of I gets 2, and I run the application, I get a compiler error. And I look down in the messages line here, and it tells me I have an unterminated string, and I see that I put a semicolon there instead of a quote, closing single quote. Now for the application, notice I say I is equal to 0, and then I've set I equal to 2, and the conditional code in the case statement has run here I is equal to 2. You can see that there. And so the case statement allows you to run conditional code with varying cases of a particular variable. And I can, of course, do anything I want inside of these different values. If I wanted to do some different code inside for 3, for the value of I equals 3, I can do that. Now the case statement only takes ordinal types, and those are usually integers, enumerated types. Enumerated types are a type we'll talk about in a future demo. And it takes characters, but it won't take strings. Strings are not ordinal. Strings can be almost infinite variety, so you can't have a string value here that doing a case off of it, but any ordinal type will work. Now the other thing we did in the previous demo was we used the for statement. For I gets 0 to 10, do, and then the code inside the subsequent statement gets executed, and we just did a simple write len here, write len I. Great. Save that. And we run that, and you'll notice now that the application does what it did before, and now it iterates over from 0 to 10, writing out the numbers. And of course, the for statement is a very, very simple iteration. Now there's 2 other ways to do iteration or repeated code in the Delphi language, and one of them is the repeat statement. We can say repeat until something is true. We can say repeat until I equals 10, for instance. And the thing we want to repeat is we want to say I gets I plus 1, and then we can write len out I again. And this time we'll put in write len can actually be overloaded to take more than one element. I is equal to as such, and now I'm going to remove this for loop just to not confuse the issue. Now if we run this, you'll notice that it basically does the same thing. Starts out equal to 0. That's from the previous entry up here. And then we started out with I equals 1, but you'll notice that the first thing we do when I equals 1 is we add to it. So this one goes from 2, and it stops at 10. You'll notice the code here says repeat, starts out with I is equal to 2, and it adds a value to I, and it keeps doing that until I equals 10. And then once I equals 10, it stops and drops down to the next line here, which is the readline, and it continues on from there. So what you get is a continuous loop of values until a certain Boolean expression becomes true. Now the trick with these, of course, is you've got to do something. You've got to ensure that this factor will, this Boolean statement will, at some point in the future, be actually evaluate to true. For instance, if we were to set this to I equals -1, and to set I equal to 0 gets 0 here, that application, if I ran it, will run forever because I will never be equal to -1 if we start at 0 and keep adding 1 to I. Well, actually I take it back. Well, at this point, no, it won't ever equal that for all practical purposes. That's the repeat loop. And the thing to note about the repeat loop is the code inside the repeat until block will execute at least once, because the code will always execute and it won't decide not to execute again until it gets down to here. So that's a key factor for remembering about the repeat loop. The code inside the repeat loop will execute at least once. Matter of fact, at this point I'm going to delete all of this code, and then we'll run this. I'll run this, and you'll see now that, whoops, I did the infinite loop, didn't I? Hit Control C. I'm sorry. Let's do it from 1 to 10. Let's do it from 1 to 10. There we go. I'm sorry. And now you'll see that it starts out at 1 and it goes through and is equal to 10. And I'm going to clean this up. I'm going to just make this so the output becomes a little clearer for what we're going to do next. The next type of iteration or continuing iteration construct in Delphi is the while do loop. This is similar to the repeat loop, but it's slightly different in a subtle way. And this way you can say while I is less than or equal to 10, do something. And that something I'll do is exactly the same code as up here. Copy that and put it in there. And now I'm going to also do a right len here so we can just be clear about what is happening doing the while loop. Now I have to do one other thing, and that is reset the value of I so that it's back to 0 for the second loop. And now we can run this, and you'll see that these two loops do something slightly different. The first loop, the repeat loop, goes from 1 to 10. The while loop, however, goes from 1 to 11. And that is because, as you'll notice in the while loop, it starts out at 0, and it executes, it writes out that doing the while loop, and then it first checks to see if I is less than or equal to 10. And if it is less than or equal to 10, it will execute this code. And since this equal sign is here, it's going to go, and it's 10, it's going to evaluate to true. To make them do exactly the same thing, let me close this one first. You want to just simply, we would simply remove this less than or equal to operator here. And now if we run, you'll notice that they'll do exactly the same thing. Now again, the subtle distinction between the two loops is that the repeat loop executes this code at least once, and the while loop may, depending upon the value of this Boolean variable here, never execute any of the code at all. Now, the interesting part about the Delphi language is that's basically the basic constructs inside the language. There aren't any more basic constructs for executing code other than the ones that we've seen in the last two demos. So that'll wrap it up for this version of Turbo Delphi Demos. I want to thank you for your attention, and keep your eyes peeled for more to come.